Now, there's been a wake-up call issued today about just how vulnerable Australia's trade routes would be should a war break out in our region, which obviously would involve China. Let's be honest, that would be the conflict. And we're just talking there about how our wine exports are going back into China. But if there was a global conflict, well, you can forget about exporting anything. An analysis of our shipping lanes, shipping routes, by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has found that 2/3 of our exports, so the vast majority of them, and 40% of our imports could come to a halt if war was to break out. It is a very chilling thought. Joining me now to discuss this is the Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, Michael Shoebridge. Michael, welcome. Ironic that we're just talking there about going back into China with our wine exports. If these shipping lanes were to be shut down during a conflict, we wouldn't be exporting anything. And how vulnerable are we on what we would be importing?
Well, Steve, you're right. There's a real schizophrenia here, isn't there? Because there are two big problems if a war broke out and our overseas trade was interrupted, and that is not exporting wine. Our two big problems are Australia is more dependent on imports from China than any other developed economy on the planet, for things like electrical goods, building supplies, even food. So instead of making that problem better by diversifying our trade, our imports away from China to other countries, the current government is talking up trade opportunities with China to make the problem worse. That's problem number one. The other problem with the current government's approach is in the defence sector, they seem to not know what Australian companies can make that will be critical to our military in times of war. And instead, they're also making us increasingly dependent on supplies from overseas from big foreign primes. So the government needs to change course on two things. They need to push companies to diversify our imports away from China, and they need to invest in domestic defence manufacturing instead of doubling down on overseas supply.
Has big business worked this out? I mean, we went through that 2 years of COVID and we had obviously the trade barriers with China, and a lot of businesses did diversify, but have they diversified enough, or are we simply now post-COVID just going to drop back into what we were doing before?
Businesses are aware of the risks, but they need sustained, consistent messages from our government. And they're not getting that now. They're getting the Prime Minister visiting Beijing and Shanghai and talking up trade opportunities. And we'll probably see more of that if the Chinese Communist Party's Premier Li visits Australia in the next few months.
Would China not also be at risk here? I mean, if suddenly Twiggy Forrest and Gina Rinehart's ships can't head off loaded up with iron ore to China, are they not going to have a major problem with the amount of iron ore that they need to keep their country running?
Well, yes. One of the big strategies, if there is a war with China, is to blockade their trade. But the Chinese, unlike us, have been stockpiling essential supplies, including things like coal and iron ore and food. They've also been investing in their domestic defence manufacturing base for decades, something that our government is failing utterly to do.
How easy would it be for China to shut down those? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, the question really is, China is making steps to make itself be able to last through a blockade, but would Australia be able to last as long as China if there was a blockade? And unless we do more to make more for ourselves than we need in times of war and diversify our trade away from China, we would be the victim in that blockade.
What would the blockade look like? I mean, how would it actually physically unfold?
Well, there are very tight sea lanes through places like the Malacca Straits up off Indonesia, and most of the trade between North Asia, a whole lot to Australia and also off to Europe and the Middle East go through those narrow straits. And then there's the coast around the east of Papua New Guinea. The US Navy, probably with the Australian Navy, should we acquire any ships, will blockade Chinese trade and Chinese military vessels there. But if we haven't diversified, we'll be blockading ourselves.